Hi everyone. Welcome to Lesson 11 of BIB 221, the Relational God. Lesson 11 covers the Davidic covenant. But before we can get into the details of that covenant, we need to spend some time covering some historical background that is important for us to understand what God is doing in the Davidic covenant. And the history that we need to look at concerns this item from the tabernacle of Moses known as the Ark of the Covenant. Now, the Ark of the Covenant was part of the Mosaic covenant. You may recall that in the wilderness, after God delivered Israel out of Egypt, God instructed Moses to build a tabernacle, which basically is a portable temple, a portable place of worship where God wanted to dwell in the midst of his people. And part of that construction involved making a box that would go into the innermost part of the tabernacle, a section of the tabernacle called the Holy of Holies. And this box was a special box. It was made out of wood, but it was overlaid with gold inside and out. And it had a lid over the top of it. And on that lid, God had Moses construct or build two cherubim, two angels with their wings outspread as they faced each other on the lid of the box. Now, inside the box, God had Moses put a pot of manna, the food, the special food that God provided for Israel that nourished them for 40 years when they wandered in the wilderness. Also in the box was Aaron's staff, his walking stick, which was a symbol of his authority. But God had done a miracle with that staff to demonstrate that he supported Aaron and Moses' authority. He made that stick bud almond buds on it in a miracle demonstration to the people that they were God's men in authority. And then lastly in the box were the tablets of stone that contained the 10 Commandments. So we have these things inside the box, but then the box was covered with a lid and placed into the Holy of Holies. And the idea was that God said to Moses, that is where I will manifest my presence. So when you need to meet with me and speak with me, you'll come into the tent and I will speak with you face to face from over the Ark of the Covenant. Now, Moses' tabernacle traveled with Israel everywhere Israel went. And eventually, when Israel came into the promised land and conquered it and possessed it, Joshua divided the land up according to the 12 tribes within Israel. And Moses' tabernacle was set up inside the territory that belonged to the tribe of Ephraim. And it was set up at a place called Shiloh. And that's where the tabernacle stayed for approximately 400 years until the time of the monarchy in Israel. However, the Ark of the Covenant inside the tabernacle was not always there. There was an event that occurred towards the end of the Judges period in Israel, just before the monarchy, where the Ark of the Covenant was taken and taken captive by one of Israel's enemies, the Philistines. The way this came to be was that there was a priest named Eli, and it was his responsibility to oversee the tabernacle and all the sacrifices and rituals around the tabernacle that are part of the Mosaic covenant, the law. And Eli had two sons who had become grown men, and they were very corrupt, and they defiled the tabernacle. At some point, Israel came to have a battle with the Philistines. And Eli's two sons, they were named Phinehas and Hophni, came up with this stupid idea that if they would take the Ark of the Covenant out of the tabernacle, take it down to the location where the battle was happening, that God would fight on behalf of Israel and defeat the Philistines, their enemies. The problem with this is that the way Hophni and Phinehas were treating the ark was very inappropriate. First of all, they weren't supposed to go in where the ark was. Only the high priest was. They went in and removed it. Secondly, they treated it kind of like a magical amulet or a talisman or something that possessed power in and of itself, and sort of like a good luck charm, and that if they just took it into battle, it would be the deciding factor and they would overcome their enemies. Well, it didn't turn out that way. And in fact, God intentionally allowed the Philistines to win the battle and to take the ark as a lesson to Israel that the way they were treating him, his holy place, and the Ark of the Covenant was wrong and sinful. You can read about this event in the book of 1 Samuel, beginning in chapter 1. In chapter 2 of 1 Samuel, we see this incident where a man of God comes to Eli and actually prophesies to him that the priesthood would be taken from him, that his two sons would die, and that he would see what is called the distress of Israel. And this took place when the Ark of the Covenant was captured by the Philistines. You can read about this defeat in 1 Samuel chapter 4, where the Ark was taken. But the point of all of this is that the Ark of the Covenant never made its way back to the tabernacle of Moses up in Shiloh. The Philistines ended up possessing the ark for about 7 months, but some very strange things happened in their territory wherever the ark went. One thing that happened was they put the Ark of the Covenant inside their temple to their god Dagon. Dagon was a fish god, and they had a statue of Dagon in their temple, and they put the Ark of the Covenant before Dagon as sort of a sign that Yahweh was now worshiping Dagon. Well, the next morning they come into their temple and they see that the statue of Dagon had fallen over. And so, thinking this is kind of curious, they just set Dagon back up and leave. Next morning they come back. This time Dagon is toppled over and his head and hands are chopped off. And, you can sort of see Yahweh having a little fun and saying, hey, I'm not worshiping Dagon. Dagon has to bow down before me. Anyway, wherever the ark goes within the territory of the Philistines, weird things like this happen. People break out in tumors, and then they send the ark to be in another village, and people there break out in tumors. Eventually, the Philistines say, okay, enough's enough. We need to get rid of this ark. It's bad news. So they put it on a cart led by 2 oxen, and they put little gold tumors in the ark to sort of appease Yahweh as an offering to Yahweh, and they send the cart back over into Israel's territory to get it off of their hands. Now, as I said, the ark never makes its way back to Moses' tabernacle in Shiloh, and without going into the whole story, it eventually ends up basically in the basement of a man's home who lives inside the territory that belongs to the tribe of Judah. Later, when David becomes king, he takes Jerusalem. He unites the tribes under his rulership, and he wants the city of Jerusalem to be the capital city of the nation of Israel. And David brings the Ark of the Covenant up from where it had eventually landed in this man's home, and he wants to put it in Jerusalem, and he constructs his own tabernacle inside Jerusalem, and he's going to put the Ark of the Covenant in his tabernacle. And we read about this in the book of 2 Samuel, chapter 6, and there's some very interesting details in that chapter that begin to give us an understanding of what God is doing in the Davidic covenant. When we read 2 Samuel 6 that tells the story of David bringing the ark up to his covenant, we read some curious details in that story. First of all, every 6 paces in the procession leading the ark up to his tabernacle, David has the procession stop and has an animal sacrificed to God. And so Every 6 paces, you can imagine the amount of blood that is being spilled in this procession. And by the way, this serves as the blood of the Davidic covenant. But once they bring the ark up to his tabernacle and set it in its place, there's some other things that happen. One, we need to note that David is wearing a linen ephod, and these are priestly garments. We read about this in the books of Exodus and Leviticus, where it talks about the priesthood that was to attend to Moses' tabernacle. This is what they wore. This is what David's wearing. And David, once the ark is set in place, he blesses the people. He offers, the text says David offers a burnt offering, and he blesses the people, and he distributes to them bread. And in the King James it says he gives them bread and wine. And that should remind you of something from the New Testament. Who else gives bread and wine? Of course, Jesus does. And I think that what's going on here is very interesting. First of all, kings were not supposed to act like priests. Saul had gotten in trouble for this. In his time as king, he had offered sacrifices to Yahweh instead of waiting for the man of God to come and do it. And he gets in trouble with God for doing that. But here with David, God seems to be okay with David dressing like a priest, offering burnt offerings like a priest, blessing the people like a priest, and distributing bread like a priest. And I think what God is doing is he's typologically showing David to be a type of Christ. In the next chapter, God's going to make a seed promise to David in the words of the Davidic covenant. And Jesus turns out to be the seed of David, the seed of Abraham, the seed of the woman. He's the fulfillment of all the seed promises. And when David, who is king, functions as priest, and by the way, he also functions as prophet, many of the psalms that David writes are very prophetic, especially about the coming Messiah. But when David functions as king and priest in bringing the ark up, he is serving as a type and a foreshadowing of Christ, the son of David, in the line of David, who would be king priest. Remember, Adam was meant to be prophet, priest, and king, and he failed when he sinned. And David now is picturing how God's going to restore that role, that function to man through the man who would be Messiah as a descendant of David. And David is prefiguring him, acting as king and priest in this narrative. Now, there's a parallel account of all this in the book of 1 Chronicles, I believe, chapter 16. And there's some interesting details in that passage that are helpful for us. One thing that we need to make sure we understand is that David left Moses' tabernacle up north. He left it standing. It was not with the ark. The ark had been taken. But he instructed the priests under the Mosaic law to keep ministering to Yahweh in Shiloh, to keep offering the sacrifices that were prescribed by the Mosaic law. But now David has a tabernacle in Jerusalem, and he puts the ark in his tabernacle, and he has an order of worship around his tabernacle. And the key differences are, in David's tabernacle, there was music. There was not music at Moses' tabernacle. There was music, and it was 24/7. It was nonstop. Another key difference between David's tabernacle and Moses' tabernacle was that, remember, Moses' tabernacle had 3 compartments. There was the outer court, the inner court, and the Holy of Holies, and only the high priest could go into the Holy of Holies. Down at David's tabernacle, it was just one section, and any of the priests could go in any time of day, any time, day or night, 24/7, 7 days a week, and it wasn't limited to just the high priest one day a year. And so what we see is, at the same time in Israel, 2 tabernacles, both in operation at the same time. Each one has its own priesthood attached to it. Each one has its own order of worship and style of worship. But David has put the ark, which represents God's presence, into his tabernacle. And that's going to become important when we get over into the New Testament, which we'll talk about here. So if we correlate what happens in Acts 15 with what happened in the history of Israel, here's what I think was going on. Remember, at the same time in the history of Israel, we have two tabernacles, two orders of worship, two priesthoods, but the Ark of the Covenant, which represents God's presence, is in David's tabernacle. 24/7 worship, access to any priest, any time of day or night, 24/7, 365, could come into God's presence. And I think what God is indicating there, besides giving us a type and a foreshadowing of Christ, who would come and establish the new covenant, is he's showing us that he's giving us a key to unlock covenantal confusion. He's indicating for us how the Mosaic law fits into the rest of the covenantal stream. And basically what I think is happening is we have the Abrahamic covenant, the covenant of promise, where he promises to make a nation of Abraham, to cause kings to be born from him, to give them a land, an inheritance, and to bring the Messiah forth through that nation to bless all the nations, the Gentiles. And that stream of promise and the example of Abraham's faith runs through to the Davidic covenant. And David is a faithful man, a man after God's own heart. And we see David doing things that seem to be violations of the Mosaic covenant. He's king acting like a priest, and he's doing things that in a tabernacle that's not the Mosaic tabernacle, and he's putting the ark there. And God seems to give his approval to all of this. And so David is in line with Abraham. He's a man of faith. He's hearing from God. He's being led by God and led by the Spirit and how he worships God. And that stream of faith, hearing with faith and obeying through faith, runs through to the new covenant that Jesus will establish, who is the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant, the Davidic covenant. And so there's a covenantal stream running through these covenants. But along the way, Israel, through doubt, through unbelief, had thought that they could be right in God's eyes according to their own efforts, and they fell down from the ground of grace and faith to the ground of law and works. And that's where we find the Mosaic covenant and the law of Moses. If you go read Galatians, where Paul is confronting this controversy about Gentile circumcision, Galatians chapter 3 is a key chapter that tells us what God was doing through the law of Moses. And there in Galatians 3, Paul says that the law was added because of transgressions. And it was added 430 years after Abraham. And so we see this covenantal stream running from Abraham to David to Jesus. But along the way, this Mosaic covenant gets added because of transgressions. And what I think is being represented is that there were two ways to relate to God. The way Abraham did, David did, and other faithful men in Israel, by faith, in that covenantal stream of promise and faith, or according to law and works. And many of the Israelites lived down on the ground of law and works and tried to establish their own righteousness in God's sight. Remember, Adam had tried to do that. After he sinned and he knew that he was naked, he tried in his own efforts to cover his nakedness with the fig leaf. But God comes along and he says, you cannot satisfactorily cover your nakedness. I need to cover you. And God performs the first animal sacrifice and clothes Adam and Eve with animal skins. And Adam and Eve have to receive that, trusting God's way is better than their way. And Paul tells us in Galatians that this is the main lesson of the law. It's a tutor that leads us to Christ. And that when Christ comes, the law is ended. Because the law was intended to show us that we can't be righteous in God's sight through our own efforts. We have to live up on the ground of grace and faith, trusting Him, being led by Him to cover us His way. And so I think that's what God is doing in this historical narrative with David and his tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant in David's tabernacle that gets picked up later by the early church in Acts 15 to settle the question of covenantal confusion. Okay, I just want to wrap some things up here at the end of this video. I'm going to have you watch another video that I did not create. I found it online, but it does a really good job of succinctly laying out what the Davidic covenant is. And in that video, you should be able to identify where we can find the words of the covenant, and also what the sign or the visible seal of the covenant, the Davidic covenant, was. I'll give you a hint. It's in Psalm 89. So when the video you watch talks about that, try to figure out what the sign of the covenant is. But here at the end of this video, I wanted to make sure you remember where we see the blood of the covenant. 2 Samuel 6, the sacrifices David made, bringing the ark up to his tabernacle. I want to share with you what the dispensation of the covenant is. Technically, the Davidic covenant doesn't have its own dispensation. It borrows the dispensation of the Abrahamic covenant, which you'll recall was the dispensation of promise. The Davidic covenant sort of is under the umbrella of the Abrahamic covenant. It's part of that promise that God made to Abraham that kings would come forth from him. And David is one of the main fulfillments of that promise. I also want to give you, just real quickly, the summary statement of the Davidic covenant. The Davidic covenant was made with David after his enthronement at Jerusalem as king of Israel. It involves David's seed and his royal house, promising that David's seed would sit on his throne forever. There's a seed promise attached to the Davidic covenant in the words of the covenant. And recall that the seed promise in the Adamic covenant identified that the Messiah would be a male human being. Then there's a seed promise in the Abrahamic covenant that identifies the coming Messiah would be someone born from the nation that God would create out of Abraham, the nation of Israel, basically. And now there's a covenant, there's a seed promise in the Davidic covenant that identifies further who the Messiah would be within the nation of Israel, that he would come from a particular tribe, the tribe of Judah within Israel, and a particular family within that tribe, the line of David of the tribe of Judah in Israel. So that wraps up the video here that I wanted to give to prep you for the Davidic covenant. And we'll see you the next time we post a video.